Welcome to Dear Fans. The grand ballroom of the Washington Liberty Hotel buzzed with excitement as guests arrived for the American Honor Gala, an event dedicated to honoring veterans, first responders, and those who had dedicated their lives to serving the country. The guest list was a who's who of politicians, military officials, celebrities, and journalists, all gathered in anticipation for the evening's main event. Among the honorees were two women from vastly different worlds, Karoline Leavitt and Caitlin Clark. Karoline, a rising star in American politics, had already become known for her unapologetic stance on patriotism and national values. Despite her youth, she had gained both admiration and criticism for her bold positions on a range of issues, particularly her advocacy for veterans and her fight against those seeking to erase the nation's identity. Caitlin, on the other hand, was a celebrated basketball icon, one of the greatest athletes of her generation. But what truly set Elle apart was not just her incredible talent on the court, but her ability to inspire millions as she used her platform to support military families and fallen heroes. Tonight, both women were being honored for their leadership in different spheres of American life. For Karoline, it was her tireless work advocating for veterans and defending American ideals. For Caitlin, it was about using her global platform to shine a light on military families and the sacrifices made by those who served. The evening began with the playing of the national anthem, and the audience stood in solemn respect. Karoline, seated in the front row, placed her hand over a folded American flag in her lap, a flag that had been given to her family after the passing of her grandfather, a World War II veteran. To her, that flag represented sacrifice, honor, and the legacy of those who fought to protect the freedoms she now held dear. Caitlin, standing on stage among the other honorees, wore a warm-up jacket embroidered with the words "Honor the Fallen," a simple yet powerful tribute to those who gave their lives in service to the country. As the anthem ended, the mood shifted when a well-known media personality seated at the VIP table stood up and addressed the room. His voice carried through the ballroom loud enough for everyone to hear. Caitlin, he began, some argue that these symbols represent a past that divides us rather than unites us in today's world. Isn't it time we move forward instead of clinging to outdated ideas of patriotism? His words struck like a knife through the room. Some in the audience nodded in agreement while others exchanged uneasy glances. A few journalists couldn't suppress smirks, already anticipating their next headline. Caitlin turned her head slightly toward Karoline, their eyes meeting for just a moment. Both women understood the question was not one of genuine inquiry, it was a challenge, a trap. Now they had a choice to make. Karoline stood slowly, the folded flag still in her hands. Her voice was steady, yet carried a quiet fire. "This flag was handed to my family in honor of my grandfather's service," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It is not outdated, it is not a political statement, it is a reminder of sacrifice, of duty, and the price paid so that we can all be here tonight, speaking freely." A murmur rippled through the audience, some nodding in agreement, others remaining silent. The journalist was unfazed, responding with a smirk. "That's one way to look at it," he said dismissively, "but don't you think that in today's world patriotism should be more about inclusivity rather than symbols from the past? Some might argue that holding on to things like that flag does more harm than good." Karoline didn't flinch. She tightened her grip on the flag, taking a step forward. "Patriotism is not exclusionary," she said firmly. "It is not a relic of the past. It is the very thing that allows us to have this conversation. And if honoring those who gave their lives for this country is seen as harmful, then perhaps the real problem is in the symbol, but the way we've been taught to view it." The tension in the room thickened. The journalist then turned to Caitlin, expecting her to distance herself from the controversy. "Caitlin, you're an athlete. Your career depends on sponsorships and endorsements, public support. Do you really want to get involved in something so polarizing?" Caitlin could have played it safe. She could have given a vague answer, something neutral to avoid ruffling feathers. Instead, she stepped forward, aligning herself with Karoline. "I play basketball because I love the game," Caitlin said, her voice clear, "but I also love this country, and I love the people who've given me the opportunity to play it. That's what this jacket represents." If that's controversial, then maybe we need to ask ourselves why. A hush fell over the crowd as the weight of Caitlin's words lingered in the air. The journalist folded his arms, clearly unimpressed. "So you're saying you don't care about how others interpret these symbols, that their pain doesn't matter?" Caitlin exhaled slowly. "What I'm saying," she responded carefully, "is that honoring the sacrifices of those who came before us doesn't erase the struggles we still need to face today. We can do both. We can remember where we came from and still work toward a better future. These things aren't opposites, they're connected." For A moment the room was silent, then from the front row a sound broke through the stillness, a slow, deliberate clap. A decorated veteran, one of the honorees of the evening, stood to his feet. He was in his late 70s, his posture still straight despite the weight of the years, his eyes locked on Karoline, then Caitlin, and finally the journalist. "I fought for this country," he said with quiet authority, "and I'm proud to stand here tonight with these two women because they understand what it means to honor the past and fight for the future." The ballroom erupted in applause, the tension dissolving into respect for the two women who had chosen to stand firm in their beliefs. The grand ballroom of the Washington Liberty Hotel was alive with energy as the American Honor Gala kicked off. The event, held to honor veterans, first responders, and those who had selflessly served their country, was packed with politicians, military officials, celebrities, and journalists, all gathered for the night's key moments. Among the honorees were two women from vastly different worlds, Karoline Leavitt and Caitlin Clark. Karoline, a young and dynamic political figure, was known for her staunch support of patriotism and national values. Despite her youth, she had already become a formidable force in Washington, admired by many and criticized by others for her unapologetic positions, particularly on veterans issues and national identity. Caitlin, on the other hand, was a basketball icon, a legend on the court. Caitlin had transcended sports, becoming a role model for millions through her advocacy for military families and fallen heroes. Tonight, they were both being honored for their leadership and contributions in their respective fields. Karoline for her advocacy for veterans and defense of American identity, Caitlin for using her platform to support military families. As the evening unfolded, the national anthem played, and the audience stood in respect. Karoline, seated in the front row, placed her hand over a folded American flag, one that had been given to her family in honor of her grandfather, a World War II veteran. Caitlin, standing on stage, wore a warm-up jacket embroidered with the words, "Honor the Fallen," a tribute to those who had given their lives in service. But the evening took an unexpected turn when a well-known media personality seated at the VIP table addressed the room. His voice rang out across the ballroom loud enough for everyone to hear. "Karoline, Caitlin," he said, "some say these symbols represent a past that divides us rather than unites us. In today's world, isn't it time we moved forward instead of clinging to outdated ideas of patriotism?" His words cut through the air like a blade. Some in the audience nodded, others shifted uncomfortably. Journalists began typing furiously, sensing the potential for a headline. Caitlin glanced toward Karoline, and in that brief moment they both understood this wasn't a question, it was a challenge, a trap. The room held its breath, waiting for their response. Karoline stood slowly, holding the folded flag in her hands. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with quiet intensity. "This flag was given to my family in honor of my grandfather's service," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It is not outdated. It is not a political statement. It is a reminder of sacrifice, of duty, and the price paid for our freedoms. It is why we can stand here today and speak freely." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, while others remained silent. The journalist, clearly unfazed, shot back, "That's one way to see it, but don't you think patriotism today should be more about inclusivity, not clinging to symbols of the past? Some would argue that holding on to things like that flag causes more harm than good." Karoline's grip tightened on the flag, and she took a step forward. "Patriotism is not exclusionary," she said firmly. "It is the very thing that allows us to have this conversation. If honoring those who fought for this country is seen as harmful, then perhaps the problem lies not with the symbol, but with the way we've been taught to view it." The tension in the room deepened. The journalist turned his gaze to Caitlin, clearly expecting her to distance herself from the controversy. "Caitlin, you're an athlete," he said. "Your career relies on sponsorships, endorsements, and public support. Do you really want to get involved in something so polarizing?" Caitlin could have taken the safe route, giving a neutral, noncommittal answer. Instead, she stepped forward. "I play basketball because I love the game," she said, her voice strong and clear, "but I also love this country and the people who've given me the opportunity to play it. That's what this jacket represents." If that's controversial, then maybe we need to ask ourselves why. A hushed silence followed her words. The journalist folded his arms, clearly unimpressed. "So you're saying you don't care how others interpret these symbols, that their pain doesn't matter?" Caitlin took a deep breath. "What I'm saying is this: honoring those who made sacrifices doesn't erase the struggles we still face. We can remember the past while working toward a better future. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, they're connected." For a moment the room was still, then a sound broke the silence, a slow, deliberate clap. A decorated veteran in his late 70s, one of the evening's honorees, had risen to his feet. straightening his back to decide the years he looked at Karoline, then at Caitlyn, and finally at the journalist. I fought for this country, he said, his voice carrying weight, and when I see young people like them standing up for what they believe in, I don't see division. One see hope. The applause that followed was immediate and thunderous. One by one people stood joining in. By the end, nearly half the room was on its feet, but not everyone clapped. Some remained seated, whisper spring among themselves. Journalists scrambled to capture every angle, preparing their spins, but the moment had already been made. Karoline and Caitlyn hand-backed down, and the world was about to witness the fallout. Within minutes, social media exploded. Clips from the event spread rapidly, shared across platforms. News outlets scrambled to cover it, each offering a different take. Some portrayed Karoline and Caitlyn as brave figures standing firm in their belief. Others painted them as reckless, divisive, and out of touch. Television commentators wasted no time analyzing the moment. On one network, a political analyst shook his head in disbelief. What message are they sending, he asked. Is this about patriotism, or is it about stirring division at an event meant to bring us together? A rival network, however, offered a different perspective. People are tired of being told to apologize for loving their country, the host said, leaning forward with conviction. Tonight we saw two young women refuse to be bullied into silence. That's not controversy, that's courage. The media frenzy was matched by an outpouring of support from veterans, organizations, military families, and ordinary citizens on social media. Many shared their own stories about the flag and the phrase "honor the fallen," explaining how it meant something far deeper than a political statement. Parents who had lost children in service posted pictures and messages thanking Karoline and Caitlyn for standing when so many others had failed to. However, backlash was swift and severe. Caitlyn sponsors were among the first to respond. Some issued cautious statements calling for respect for all viewpoints, while others went silent. A few sponsors even began reevaluating their relationships with her, and behind-closed-doors deals with other athletes were considered just in case Caitlyn became a risk. Karoline, meanwhile, faced pressure from political circles. Allies distanced themselves, careful not to be associated with a controversy. Some reached out privately to advise caution, while others publicly criticized her for turning a solemn event into a spectacle. Journalists scoured her past interviews, searching for anything to support their narrative. Speculation ran rampant, with some questioning whether Caitlyn had jeopardized her career, while others suggested that Karoline had orchestrated the moment for political gain. 3 days after the gala, Karoline and Caitlyn met in private. The whirlwind that followed the event had taken both by surprise, yet when they sat down there was no regret in their eyes. They wanted us to fold, Karoline said, leaning back at her chair. They thought the pressure would be too much. Caitlyn nodded. I've faced expectations before, but nothing like this, she said. But if I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing. The media frenzy continued, but at that table the decision had already been made. They had stood up for something bigger than themselves, and despite the relentless scrutiny, they weren't about to apologize. The controversy was far from over, but Karoline and Caitlyn had no intention of backing down. Their stance had become more than a moment. It was a statement, and no matter how hard the media tried to control the narrative, they were determined to hold their ground as the media relentlessly pushed the narrative of division, attempting to paint Caitlyn and Karoline as reckless or misguided. Something unexpected began to happen. Despite the constant barrage of criticism, public sentiment wasn't shifting in the direction the media had hoped for. Veterans groups continued to speak out, calling attention to the double standards, while athletes from other sports began voicing their support, some cautiously, others boldly. A viral video montage surfaced, showcasing historic moments of American athletes and leaders standing up for their country, drawing powerful parallels to Caitlyn and Karoline. The tide was beginning to turn, but then came the moment no one had seen coming. A retired 4-star general, someone with real influence and a reputation that commanded respect, went on live television. He wasn't just another pundit or talking head. He was a man whose words carried weight across the nation. Leaning forward, looking directly into the camera, his voice was calm, yet sharp. I served this country for over 30 years. I lost friends in battle, and let me tell you something, when I see two young women stand up for what they believe in, I don't see division, one see courage. And if we've reached a point where showing respect to those who sacrifice for us is controversial, then the problem isn't with them, it's with us. The studio fell silent. The host, clearly caught off guard, struggled for words, but the image had already been done. That moment, captured on air, spread like wildfire, changing the entire conversation. Within hours, news outlets that had been critical of Karoline and Caitlyn began to shift their tone, some quietly edited previous articles, softening their language. Others invited new guests to their panels. Those with a more sympathetic view, sponsors who had distanced themselves from Caitlyn, started reaching out again. Their PR team scrambled to recover from the backlash they had stirred. Some even issued public statements of support for her. For Karoline, the pressure from political figures started to fade. Politicians who had been critical of her now conveniently avoided the topic altogether. Those who had stayed silent suddenly found their voices praising her for standing firm in her beliefs. By the end of the week, it was clear the storm had just passed. It had backfired. The media's attempt to control the narrative had only exposed their true motive. Karoline and Caitlyn had not only defended their positions, they had won, and when they appeared together in public again, they both knew one thing for certain: they would never be silent again. The storm had forged them into something stronger. The media, once confident they could pressure them into an apology or retreat, had underestimated the power of conviction. The more the media tried to frame the story as controversial, the more the public saw through the manipulation. Karoline returned to her political work with even more influence than before. Her refusal to back down had solidified her reputation as a leader who stood firm in her values, no matter the pressure. The very people who had once advised her to stay silent were now praising her for her unshakable principles. Caitlyn, despite the initial fallout, found her fanbase only growing stronger. Sponsors who had hesitated were replaced by new ones, brands that valued authenticity over convenience. When she returned to the court, the ovation she received from the crowd told her everything she needed to know. The controversy that had been meant to break them had only elevated them to legendary status. As they parted ways after their next public event, Caitlyn turned to Karoline with a smirk. "So I guess we're troublemakers now." Karoline left. "We always were, they just didn't see it coming." Though the cameras still followed them and the media continued to spin the story, it no longer mattered. The truth had already been spoken, and no one could take that back. Like this video and subscribe this channel. Thank you.